like to welcome everyone back to our third session of this multi-part lecture series. And as you may remember, when we closed up shop last time, we decided we were going to talk about the history of ancient Israel this next time. So we'll talk a little bit about Israel and Judea and Palestine and what these terms mean and what the difference is between them. So let me say a few things about those words and those titles. We usually refer to the region as Israel. If you go back far enough, the people of Israel, or the Israelites, are referred to as the Hebrews. And this, in English, the word Hebrew refers both to the language and also to the ethnicity, coming from the Hebrew word Ivrim. If I've formed my fonts correctly, which is the name of the people themselves, the Ivrim, the Hebrews, plural. And this term is utilized for the Hebrew people prior to their settling in the land of Israel. And upon settling in Israel, they are usually referred to as the Israelites. It is not until after the Babylonian exile in 587, 586 BC that we have them starting to be called the Jews or the Judeans. It's actually during the Persian period following the Babylonian exile that we see them called Jews or Judeans. Now you may ask, well, what about the term Palestine or Palestinians? And this, of course, is another term that has a lot of historical significance and development to it. And essentially, it is a term that is used in the Greco-Roman period to refer to this region, and it's almost perhaps an insult because it is referring to that region by way of the Philistines. This is the Greek and Roman way of rendering the term Philistines, who you may remember are some of the ancient enemies of the Israelites. So it's referring to that region as well as the land of the Philistines. Hence it is Romanized or Graicized, Hellenized as Palestina. And we see the province later being referred to as Palestina, the Roman province of Palestine. This term then continues to be used throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern period, and it is then applied to a particular ethnicity of non-Jews living in the state of Israel, referred to as Palestinians. So this is just a little bit of background for where that term comes from and why we have these different terms hovering around all within our semantic domain, if you will, that we're using all these terms simultaneously, interchangeably. So let's talk a little bit about the history of early Israel, all the way back to the time of the Hebrews. The nation of Israel, in a lot of ways, is a nation that has been under the domination of many foreign powers during many different periods. Israel's history is marked by foreign domination and resistance to that foreign domination, recovery from that foreign domination, regrowth after that foreign domination. So we have a number of different periods that mark Israelite history, and we can speak of them in the following manner. We speak of the Egyptian period, the Assyrian period, Babylonian, Persian period, the Greek or Hellenistic period, which we talked about last time, and of course the Roman period. And many of these do not have hard and fast beginning or ending times, but there is a certain amount of overlap between them. They also do not necessarily fall successively after one another. We do have periods of independence in between certain ones. So since this series is not intended to focus exclusively or intensively or extensively on Israelite history, we're not going to go too deeply into that, but I just want to use this as a little bit of a quick refresher to remind you a little bit of what you already know, hopefully, about Jewish and Israelite history. In terms of the Egyptian period, you remember things, if If you've never even studied the period, I'm sure you probably remember this sort of thing from Sunday school or from any religious instruction that you may have received, the story of Moses and the exodus of the Israelites coming out of Egypt and so forth. And in terms of the long history of Israel that's told in the Bible, you have a period where Egypt has control over the Hebrew people. And this ends approximately, and some of these dates, as I said, are not hard and fast, somewhere approximately in the 1200s BC. Now, by the way, if I did not already mention this, I will mention it again. We sometimes have a certain interchangeability between the term BC and BCE. And I want you to know this. BC, of course, everyone knows is before Christ. This is the standard method of telling time prior to the birth of Christ, the Christian era. But in more recent years, scholars have come to call it BCE, which is a slightly more politically correct way of referring to it. And this is the cipher for before the Common Era. Now, when does the Common Era begin? Once again, with the birth of Christ. So it's really not much of an improvement over the already Christocentric term before Christ, but it is, once again, a little tip of the hat at recognizing that not everybody in the world ascribes to the same set of ideals or telling of time. So the converse of BC in traditional language is AD, which is Latin for Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. This designates the time after the birth of Christ up until the present moment. And in the new system, they refer to it as CE, of the Common Era. So I just wanted to bracket that for a moment, and you'll probably hear me refer to these interchangeably just as the moment strikes me. Don't get confused. So we see in the 1200s BC, approximately that time period, we have the Exodus, where a large number of Hebrews exit or leave the land of Egypt under some type of circumstances. And I won't delve into the historicity of the biblical account, but just suffice to say that that is the approximate time period then that would have taken place, perhaps under one of the pharaohs such as Ramses II or Seti I. The Israelite conquest of the land of Israel comes after that. We then have the time period in which King Saul is mentioned in the Old Testament texts. Then King David, his successor, unifies the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah, unifies them together. And so King David becomes the first king of unified Israel, the beginning of the monarchy, the unified monarchy. And this is approximately in 1000 BC that David comes to power. So these are, once again, just all approximates, circa 1000 BC. Then his son Solomon builds the temple, and we refer to this as the first temple or the Solomonic temple. And prior to this time, the God of the Israelites, who, as I had mentioned in a previous session, is called Yahweh, and I will write this out in English letters, Yahweh, because Hebrew is a language that does not have definite vowels. The vowels are essentially supplied in later texts. The manuscripts only provide the consonants, so it is really difficult for us to understand exactly how the Israelites pronounced that name. This is the personal name of God. So scholars in recent years have reconstructed it to be something like Yahweh. Now, earlier scholars of the Middle Ages and the early Enlightenment, since many of the more prominent scholars were German, the Hebrew letter Yud that we are rendering as Y, the German scholars rendered as a J, since J in German is pronounced as a Y, and so for them it becomes JHWH or JHVH. This is essentially an attempt to render the Hebrew name Yod, He, Vav, He in Hebrew letters. And once again, I will apologize to anyone who is offended by this, my writing of this on a board. But for scholarly purposes, I'm going to forge ahead. So once again, this corresponds with the Y in English. You see the both H's, and the Vav, which is sometimes a vowel and sometimes a consonant, could be rendered as a W or a V. So it is this attempt to render the holy name of God by German scholars of the 16, 17, 1800s that comes out sounding something like Jehovah, which is where more traditional people, such as scholars of earlier periods and also the sect of Christians known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, get that name for God. So this is an attempt to render the Yod-He-Vav-He name of God in the Old Testament. Now, at some point, I will digress for a second, at some point in Jewish history, it became considered that it was too holy. God's name was too holy to say or to even write out sometime prior to the time of Jesus, because we already see this trend in Jewish literature of the time where people simply would not pronounce the name of God. They would not say it out when they read the texts. Instead, they would substitute the cipher of saying, my Lord, or our Lord. And in Hebrew, it's Adonai, my Lord. This is one of the reasons why in your English Bibles, you'll probably notice all throughout the Old Testament, you'll have L-O-R-D in capital letters. This is the way of the translator to render that particular cipher for the holy name of God, the four-letter name of God, which is sometimes referred to as the tetragrammaton, which just comes from Greek meaning four letters. So those particular four letters, the holy four letters. So at some point prior to Jesus, we have evidence of this trend where people no longer are pronouncing the holy name of God. It is no longer said out. If you see it in the text, don't say it. Just instead say Adonai. Give it a certain amount of reverence. So one might say, I am not giving sufficient reverence to the name here, but for the purpose of education and edification, I'm going ahead with this. So perhaps when I erase this from the board and show it the ultimate amount of disrespect, maybe you can just turn your heads and ignore that I've done that. So anyway, during this time period, about 1000 BC, Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, is worshipped in a nomadic form. The Israelite people are largely nomadic. They come from nomadic tribes. They worship Yahweh in a tent, a tabernacle, rather than a permanent place. And throughout the Old Testament, there is always this tension between the old way being the right way, when Yahweh was still worshipped in a tent, in a mobile form, as opposed to when Solomon, the son of King David, does actually create a static building, a temple, where Yahweh is worshipped permanently. And so there is a tension between the ideology, the theology of these two camps, the more nomadic form versus the permanent or sedentary form. So ultimately, Solomon builds the temple to Yahweh in the 10th century BC, perhaps somewhere towards the end of the 10th century, somewhere in the late 900s BC. It is after this time period we have the monarchy continuing for a few hundred years. Somewhere in the 8th century, in the 700s BC, we have the northern kingdom of Israel is invaded and occupied by the Assyrians, who are an ethnicity that would roughly correspond with modern Persia. But we will note that the people of Persia go through many different empires that occupy that land. So in this period we are referring to them as the Assyrian Empire. Later on we will speak of them as the Persian Empire. In a much later period, that area is even occupied by what we speak of as the Parthian Empire. But once again, many different empires occupy that land, that region. So in this period, in the 8th century BC, the Assyrians take over the northern kingdom of Israel, the northern half of unified Israel. So we have, for the first time since King David, a divided monarchy, and we have a foreign nation occupying a portion of Israel. So that lasts for a significant amount of time until in the 6th century BC, we have the Babylonian Empire, which roughly corresponds with the modern nation of Iraq in that region. In 587, 586 BC, we have the Babylonian Empire coming in and supplanting the Assyrians in all of Israel. And in 587, 586 BC, the Babylonians come in and destroy the temple that had been erected under Solomon, the first temple. It is destroyed. And all of Israel's intellectual and cultural and social elite, all of the high-ranking people, are transported in a form of slavery. They are transported to the city of Babylon. And we refer to this as the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile, where all of Israel's cultural and intellectual elite are now in captivity in Babylon. And this begins a period of theological reflection and turmoil for Israel, where Israel begins to question, what did we do wrong? What did we do to deserve this? And I'll get back to this in a minute when we start talking about the theology of the time period and the theology of later time periods. So this entire period prior to Babylon we call the First Temple period, actually from approximately 900 BC after the construction of the First Temple to the time when it is destroyed in 587, 586 BC. That is the First Temple period, because it is the period of Israelite history that is governed by the First Temple, or the Solomonic Temple. Now after this, approximately a generation, Israel is in captivity in Babylon. There is a remnant of people who are still living in Israel, in the region around Jerusalem. They are spoken of as the remnant. But in approximately 540, 539 BC, the Persian Empire, now no longer having anything to do with the Assyrians, the Persian Empire comes in and conquers the Babylonian Empire and frees the Israelites. And under this new regime, we see Israel starting to flourish in many ways. Things, of course, were not perfect. There are many complaints among the Israelites, but in general, Israel flourishes under Persian rule. And this is one of the things one of the fallacies that we see perpetrated in movies such as 300, which were an absolutely charming movie, but in terms of the notion of the Persian Empire as some type of evil empire that is spreading its unholy rule over the entire world, and the Spartans being the one bastion of democracy as the holdout against the Persians coming in and forcing everyone into slavery. This is not entirely correct. And I mentioned two inaccuracies. Number one, of course, the Spartans were essentially a slave state. The Spartans themselves, living in the region of Laconia in Greece, in the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the Spartans really were only a small portion of the inhabitants of Laconia. The Spartans themselves, a warrior aristocracy, lived off the backs of the slave class, the Helots, and they kept the Helots in check and in constant fear by occasionally or periodically having what would be the equivalent of pogroms or raids on the Helots to keep them down, to keep them in check, to make sure that the Helots would always live in fear of the Spartan aristocracy. So this, I do not think, would really be properly called a democracy. But nonetheless, on the other hand, the Persian Empire was a largely very tolerant empire. This is perhaps in some ways the precursor to the tolerance that we see in the Roman period. In many ways, the Persian Empire would come into a region, would of course impose its overall government on that particular region, but they would set up certain forms of government that would allow the locals to persist in their own cultural ways, in their own forms of government, to govern themselves, to persist in utilizing their own languages. The fact that The Persian Empire now had its own ways of governing the larger body. It had, of course, their own language, the Aramaic language, which was their primary language of government and administration of their empire. But for the most part, they were largely a tolerant empire, and we see this played out in the relationship between Israel and Persia. When Persia liberates Israel, Israel begins to flourish in a way that it had not flourished during the Babylonians. The next king of the Babylonians actually supports a program of rebuilding the temple that had been destroyed. And by approximately 515 BC, we see the temple project completed. So with Persian money under Persian control, the temple is now rebuilt. The temple that had been destroyed under the Babylonians. And in this period, we begin to see Israel taking on many aspects of Persian religion, Persian culture. Persia has a significant influence on Israel's cosmology, and we will get back to that in a moment. But in this period, there is largely a sense of progress and flourishing in Israel. Then in the late 4th century BC, as we had mentioned last time, Alexander the Great comes in and conquers the Persian Empire and establishes his own rule over what had formerly been Persian holdings. So in this period, which we call the Second Temple period, this period is the Second Temple because it is governed by the Second Temple that exists in Israel, having been rebuilt under the Persians. We see the Greeks coming in, taking over the Persians, taking over their former empire, and of course imposing Hellenistic rule, imposing the Greek language as the primary language, the lingua franca, as we had mentioned last time. It supplants Aramaic, which had been the official language of the Persian Empire, the language of administration. And we see the Greek, the Hellenistic forms of government encouraging the locals to think of themselves as something more than just merely whatever ethnicity they held. So we see that same kind of idea in the Persian period. The Persians are asking people to understand themselves as something more than merely Syrian or Greek, Athenian, Mesopotamian, and so forth. They are now part of something larger. They're part of the Persian world, the Persian Empire. This is a unifying factor. The same kind of thing we see applied by the Hellenistic Empire. You are no longer merely Syrians or Persians or Greeks. You are part of something larger. You are part of the Hellenistic Empire. So you need to recognize that in addition to your local native languages, you should also be speaking Greek. In the marketplace, we are going to proliferate Greek forms of art, culture, music, food, language, literature, science, government, and so forth. You are now part of something bigger than merely your old little native homeland. So we see that initially it is the Seleucids who are in charge of Israel, the dynasty of Seleucus, the former general of Alexander the Great. Initially, they are slated to rule Israel. Then, almost immediately after that, the Ptolemies wind up coming in and taking over. Now, you remember the Seleucids settled in Syria. That was where their dynasty was based. That is their base of operations. The Ptolemies settled in Egypt. That was their base of operations. And so from approximately 200 BC, approximately from 301 BC to 200 BC, we have the Ptolemaic period, where the Ptolemies are in charge of Israel, ruling from Egypt, but in charge of Israel. So approximately 100 years, we see Hellenistic Greek rule under the Ptolemies in Israel. Now, approximately 200 BC, the Seleucids take over. The Seleucids, once again, warring constantly with the Ptolemies, approximately 200 BC, the Seleucids take over Israel. They wrest Israel out of the control of the Ptolemies. And in this time period, we see an increased amount of Hellenization of that region. Now, this is not to say that Israel had not been Hellenized in any way, shape, or form prior to that. That would not be true. That would be an overstatement, a biased overstatement. But from this time period, we see an increased amount of Hellenization under a number of the Seleucid monarchs, such as Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And it is under him, from approximately 175 to 164 BC, that we see the outrages that ultimately give rise to the Maccabean Revolt, which encapsulates what we know to be the Hanukkah story, where because Antiochus Epiphanes thinks he is doing a favor for the Jewish people, and remember, from the Persian period onward, we're referring to these people as the Jews or the Judeans, as opposed to the Israelites or the Hebrews in this period. But Antiochus Epiphanes believes that he is doing a favor for the Jews by helping to increase the Hellenization of that region. But of course, many of the locals feel that this is watering down their culture, that this is watering down their understanding of their own identity by bringing in these foreign ways, these foreign religions. And we'll get back to this and the importance of that in a minute. But the rebellion, the Maccabean Revolt, which is approximately from 168 to 165 BC, in which a local grassroots rebellion arises under Judah Maccabee, a local warlord, and his family, which essentially comes and challenges and really does remove power from the rulership of the Seleucid dynasty. Challenges their power, and ultimately, within a few decades after that, solidifies the autonomy of Israel. The Seleucids are kicked out ultimately, and it establishes a dynasty of Israelites, Judeans, ruling themselves under what is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. This is the result of the Maccabean Revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty, which rules for approximately a century, from the time of the Maccabean Revolt to the time that Pompey the Great, the Roman general, comes in and settles disputes in Israel in 63 BC and ultimately makes Israel a province of the Roman Empire. So there's approximately a century of autonomy in that time period. And it is that very sentiment, that sense of autonomy that the Israelites have in that time period that gives them a taste of what they had had long before. And it is this sentiment that perhaps sparks further rebellions against the Romans over the course of the next 2 centuries or so, causes so much unrest in Israel, because Israel has tasted autonomy, they have tasted independence, and they want it back. But this rebellion, the Maccabean Revolt, is marketed to the people in religious terms, in cultural terms. That we don't want those nasty Greeks having their control over us, forcing us to water down our culture, forcing us to give up the ways of our ancestors. We are going to remain Jews, remain solid in our Israelite religion. But this is somewhat of a misconception, because as much as the rebellion was marketed or billed as a more religiously and culturally based rebellion, in fact, there was much widespread acceptance of Hellenistic culture prior to that time period. For the most part, the Jews as a whole did not truly complain about the benefits that they had gained from Hellenistic rule and increased Hellenization. And really, one can easily interpret this rebellion at its core as being primarily something of nationalistic fervor as opposed to cultural and religious purposes. So once again, in 63 BC, we then finally have Sextus Pompey walking in to settle a dispute between 2 of the rival rulers of the Jews at the time period, 2 brothers of the Hasmonean dynasty who were both claiming the high priesthood, and Sextus Pompey favors one of them and ultimately establishes Roman rulership over the region. And any of the kings who are established under the Romans from that point onward are essentially puppet kings or client kings, vassals under the Roman Empire. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the Hasmonean rule of Palestine was coming to an end. It had been established by the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids and lasted nearly a century. By 67 BC, two sons of Alexandra, widow of the king Alexander Jannaeus, were feuding. Both sons, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, appealed to Pompey the Great to intervene and help restore order. Pompey entered the temple in 63 BC, ending a long siege in which Aristobulus had barricaded himself in the temple. Pompey favored Hyrcanus's claim to the high priesthood, and the Hasmonean dynasty was thus able to continue its influence in Palestine with newly limited authority, now subservient to Roman occupation and oversight. Hyrcanus's Idumean minister, Antipater, seeing that Caesar was now in a position of power, assisted the new master in his campaigns in the region by providing him with troops to help during the conquest of Egypt, and also by convincing the Alexandrian community of Jews to lend their support to Caesar. Ultimately, Antipater's son, Herod, acceded to power in Judea. One must remember that Herod too was an Idumean, the Semitic ethnicity that was forced under the Maccabees to convert to Judaism several generations prior. After the Romans had successfully driven the Parthians out of Syria, the larger province to which Judea belonged, Herod was confirmed by the Senate as king of Judea. Herod, initially a favorite of Antony, came to Octavian immediately after the former's suicide to profess his allegiance. His position was therefore reconfirmed. Herod would serve for many years in his position and indeed proved to be a true supporter of Roman imperial rule rather than a proponent of a return to Hasmonean autonomy. Herod, though extremely unpopular with his subjects, continued to receive imperial support. His will and testament received the ratification of Augustus after Herod's death in 4 BC. His 3 sons, to whom he had given parts of his kingdom, were endorsed by Roman rule. Herod's son, Archelaus, received rulership of Judea and Samaria, but due to his incompetence, he was deposed in 6 AD and exiled to the province of Gaul. Subsequently, the provinces of Judea and Samaria were directly governed by Roman rule in the following period. One of Herod's other sons, Antipas, was given Galilee and continued to rule from the time of his father's death in 4 BC until 39 AD. It was this Herod, called Herod Antipas, that was consulted regarding Jesus' trial, as reported in the Gospels. It was his father, Herod the Great, who had been ruler when Jesus was born. It was also he who had ordered the census to be taken to assist in the administration of Roman rule. After the death of Herod the Great, an uprising took place in Judea which threatened the rulership of his son, Archelaus. The governor of Syria, the larger province to which Judea belonged, was forced to intercede with 3 legions of soldiers, and the rebellion was definitively put down. The cities of Sepphoris and Emmaus were both destroyed, and 2,000 participants and leaders of the rebellion were crucified. The legions did not take up permanent residence in the region of Judea, but continued to be stationed in Syria near to that province's governor. At this time, Judea was considered an extremely minor province, even though it was considered a part of the province of Syria, which was arguably one of Rome's most important ones, on account of its position of sharing a border with the Parthian Empire, Rome's troublesome neighbors. As such, Judea was governed not by a senatorial governor or a procurator, but rather by a prefect, or praefectus, who was of equestrian rank. As an equestrian, this prefect was not entitled to have legions under his command, but rather had auxiliary troops to control. The Gospels, all written at least a generation after the accounts that they relay, utilize Greek terms that render the Latin title procurator, the title that would later be given to governors of the United Province of Palestine. In this time period, however, governors such as Pontius Pilate were called praefectus, as confirmed by an inscription found in Caesarea, the Roman governmental capital of Judea. Let's step back for a little bit and we'll talk a bit about the religious history of Israel, now that we've talked about the political, national history of Israel. In the First Temple period, this period here, Israelite religion is what we call henotheistic. And there are vestiges of this in the earliest layers, the earliest stages of the Old Testament. Sometimes people wonder, why is it that in the Genesis account, God talks about that we shall make man in our image? Why is this a plural rather than a singular? Why doesn't he say, I will make man in my image? He says our image. Also, one of the epithets for God, one of the names, is Elohim. In Hebrew, that is a plural form, even though it refers to the one God of Israel. Why is it in a plural form, grammatically speaking? The scholars have speculated that this is because in the early time period of Israelite religion is not monotheistic. And you remember in our previous session, we talked about monotheism. Monotheism, which means worship of one and only one God. This as opposed to polytheism. Polytheism, which is the worship of many gods. But there is something in between. We might say a sort of a middle ground, which is henotheism. This is why I make the qualification that monotheism is not merely worship of one God, it is worship of one and only one God. Because the Greek root hen or hena means one. In addition to mono meaning one or only one. This means the number one. So it is a reference to the notion of a culture worshiping one God, but recognizing the existence of many other gods. So it's as if to say, well, there are other gods out there, but this God is our God. He's the best. He's the best and biggest and baddest, and he's our protector. That's henotheism. And there are a number of cultures in the ancient Near East that are, at this time, not polytheistic, not monotheistic, but they are henotheistic. And the larger grouping of Canaanite tribes that Israel grew out of, most of them were henotheistic. And scholars have come to know, to understand that while the Canaanites are referred to in the Old Testament as the enemies of Israel, really, if we recognize a lot of the good work and research and understanding that has taken place over the last century or two of scholarship in biblical studies, we recognize that in reality, the Israelites were one of the tribes that occupies a place in the larger grouping of Canaanite tribes or Canaanite ethnicity. And if we look at some of the myths, some of the stories of the ancient Canaanites, we see some very similar stories to the stories that are told about Yahweh, but with Canaanite gods in their place, such as the god El or the god Baal. Baal, who is mentioned in the Old Testament as the god of those evil Canaanites, he is the opponent of Yahweh. He's his rival, culturally speaking, religiously speaking. The god of this people, this henotheistic people, they favor that god. That's their god. That's their protector. Baal is their protector. He's our God. We love him the best. This people over here, they are championed by this God, by Yahweh. He's our God. He's the best. We will worship none other but him. So each religion is recognizing the existence of the other religion's gods, other gods in general, but worshiping only one, only ours. So we see the Israelite religion in the First Temple period being marked by henotheism. Henotheism, as opposed to monotheism. So we have evidence of that in some of the earliest scriptures, the earliest scriptural layers of the Old Testament, where we see God talking about us, which most probably is referring to Yahweh in the midst of the council of the gods, a vestige from Israelite religion's roots in the larger context of Canaanite religions. So, First Temple period, Israelite religion, henotheistic, not monotheistic. Now this also goes hand in hand with what we were talking about last time, the worldview known as monism. Now you already know from our discussion that monos, or mono, in Greek means one and only one. It literally means only. So monism is the worldview that there is only one world, one plane of existence. We dealt with this last time. What are some of the characteristics of monistic worldview? The belief that history is cyclical rather than linear, that there is only one body, that there is no clear-cut concept of a life after death, there is no reward and punishment in the afterlife. Rewards and punishments come in this life. And that there is no soul that survives the body. It is this body that is your identity. And the creator deity, whoever has created you, has breathed the breath of life into you. And it is that breath that animates you, that gives you life, as opposed to an additional non-corporeal entity that we might call a soul. That is not fully conceived of in this time period. So those are some of the features or elements, characteristic elements of monism as a worldview, as a cosmology. By the way, cosmology, cosmos means universe, anything ending in ology is the study of. So cosmology is the study of the universe, or a conception of a worldview. So as we had said, diametrically opposed to monism is the other worldview called dualism. Dualism is the philosophy or worldview that the universe can be broken into two diametrically opposed camps, that it is comprised of a series of dualities. Light, dark, up, down, this world, the next world, body, soul, good, evil, and so forth. In the dualistic conceptions of the universe, there is an ultimate source of evil, whereas in monism there is not. This world is good in monism. There's nothing wrong with this world. Think of early Israelite religion. Think of what we see in the Old Testament with Yahweh saying that he creates things and then he saw that it was good. The world is good. In the earliest stages of the Old Testament, there is no ultimate source of evil like a devil. The serpent in the Genesis account is not necessarily the devil. It is a serpent. It is a mythological or a mythical embodiment of questioning or challenging God's authority and enlightening people to see something more than what they have initially been given to understand. But it is only in later periods, perhaps in Christian theology, that we see the serpent of the Genesis account being identified with the devil, being identified with Satan. It is not necessarily so in the earliest understandings of it. So if we look at that Genesis account as an example of monistic thought, you just see that God's original creations have become wicked. Not evil, but wicked. So all throughout the earliest stages of the Old Testament that are written in the monistic period, in the monistic understanding, in the First Temple period, people that disobey God, people that go against God's will, it's not that they are invested with the spirit of evil. It's not that they have been tempted by the devil. There is no devil just yet. It is that they are like disobedient children who have strayed from God, and they are going to be punished. You slap them, you get them back into shape, you get them back into condition. And in much of the Old Testament, we see God castigating Israel or chiding Israel, showing Israel the right way, bringing them back into balance with God's will. These are elements of monistic worldview. So there is no clear-cut life after death in the monistic understanding of the world, much in the same way as in Greek religion, early Greek religion, of a monistic worldview. In Israelite religion also, early Israelite religion, the First Temple period, there is no clear-cut concept of a life after death. Your shade, or your Rephaim, is merely your life force that goes into Sheol. Sheol is the rough equivalent in Israelite religion of the Greek Hades. It's the underworld. It is where Yahweh does not have control or have power. It's not that that his power as God is limited, but that it's just not his sphere of influence. It is the underworld, where the shades in Sheol do not praise Yahweh, as it says in one of the Psalms. So it is a dark and gloomy existence, or a non-existence rather. So Israelite religion of this time period privileges, it focuses, it emphasizes on this life, this world. good things will come to you in this world if you are good, bad things will come to you in this life if you are bad. You are repaid in this life for good and bad things that happen. It is relatively immediate. And if it doesn't happen to you in this life, it will happen to the next generation. And so we see conceptions of children suffering for the sins of their parents. So these are some of the theological ideas that are tossed around, that are explored in the monistic worldview. So once again, these are attempts to answer the question of why are there bad things in the universe? And this is an ongoing problem, an ongoing debate, an ongoing theological question that we see answered, or at least attempts to answer it, are made throughout the time periods. In the early Israelite period, the monistic worldview is what is used to answer that question. Essentially, if something bad happens to you, you must have done something to deserve it. If you're a good person, bad things will not happen to you, or at least in some way, shape, or form, you will be compensated for it. Now, of course, the book of Job is problematic in that respect because it's beginning to question that theology. It's saying, yeah, but sometimes bad things do happen to good people. Why? So the book of Job addresses that problem, that question in its own way. So, don't confuse monism with monotheism. They are two separate things. And in the early Israelite period, in the First Temple period, we see a monistic worldview going hand in hand with henotheism as an understanding of God, as a theology. So monism and henotheism. In the Greek system, we see monism going along with polytheism, a belief in many gods, but a belief in only this world being the only life, that the world is comprised of a unified whole as opposed to dualities. So, conversely, in the Second Temple period, the period where we speak of these people as the Jews as opposed to the Israelites, from the Persian period onward, we see the cosmology becoming more dualistic, prevalent cosmology. Dualism, once again, believing in a concept of life after death, that the soul survives the body, that there is reward and punishment in the afterlife, if not in this life, that there is a clear-cut concept of a devil, an ultimate source of evil in the universe. So people who are wicked are not merely disobeying God, they are actually siding with the opponent of God. They are siding with the adversary of God. So it's an entirely different cosmology based in duality, based in this ultimate battle between God and the devil, the forces of good and the forces of evil. And Israelite religion, ultimately becoming Jewish religion, is influenced by the major religion of Persia, known as Zoroastrianism at that time. And Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion. It is also monotheistic. Persian Zoroastrianism believes in one and only one God. It does, of course, recognize the existence of a devil, but does not consider this devil worthy of being called a god. Nonetheless, people can debate over whether that is a form of polytheism, or what one author calls inclusive versus exclusive monotheism. These are gradations of monotheism, but nonetheless it is monotheism, the worship of one and only one God, and the recognition of only one God that creates the universe. So this monotheism is an element or a feature of Persian Zoroastrian religion, that is then taken into or influences Israelite religion, influences Jewish religion. The dualistic worldview, the dualistic cosmology of Persian Zoroastrianism, that there is good and evil, a body and a soul, this life and the afterlife, that time is linear, that you have a beginning, a creation, and you have an end of time. This is a function of the dualism of Persian religion. Now, why would you have an end of time? Because God created the world good. It is a good world. But somehow evil has invaded the world, has infested it. Like an invasion. It has infected it. And ultimately needs to be purged. The world needs to be purged of its evil influences. That will be done at the judgment day, at the end of time, the eschaton, a word we'll come back to, which just simply in Greek means end. So these ideas, the idea of an eschaton, a judgment day, an end of time, where the good world will be purged of its evil influences, Judaism obtains this from Persian Zoroastrianism. And we see Jewish religion of that time period taking on more and more of the elements that are gleaned from their Persian liberators. It has been said, whose bread I eat, his song I sing. That is, the one who provides bread and sustenance for us, we tend to favor that person and their viewpoints, their ideologies, and so forth. And so, because of Israel's reliance upon Persia in this time period and thereafter, we do see that incorporation of a lot of Persian ideals in many of the elements of Jewish religion from that time period onward. So to recap a few points, in the pre-exilic period, which as we had mentioned is the First Temple period, the period in which we speak of Israelite religion, there is no clear-cut concept of a life after death. We have Sheol as the only afterlife that is spoken of, and it is roughly comparable to the Greek version called Hades. In the post-exilic period after the Babylonian exile, otherwise known as the Second Temple period, because it's governed by the Second Temple that rules in Israel, we have a more clear-cut concept of life after death in many of the sects or understandings of Judaism, and evil takes on more cosmic proportions, as opposed to merely being interpreted as the wickedness of disobedient children that would be reproved or corrected by God. So it's more of a sense of you are actually supporting the evil side in the universe that is sponsored by the devil as an ultimate source of evil. So once again, history is viewed as linear in this time period as opposed to cyclical, which is from the monistic worldview in the First Temple period. Now, some of the big questions that are at stake here, once again, are why is there wickedness or suffering or evil in the universe? So in the First Temple period, in the pre-exilic period, there is more of an emphasis on this life. There is an emphasis on corporate responsibility. So the entirety of the nation suffers for the sins of the few. So everyone is punished and everyone is brought to correction, brought back to righteousness. In situations where correction and reprovement in this life is not possible, where where compensation for suffering is not possible in this life, then we talk about generational responsibility. So it's once again trying to answer the question of why is there suffering in the world. But the theologians of this time period with the Babylonian captivity asking that question think, yeah, but we didn't do anything wrong. What did we do to deserve this? We thought we were doing the right thing. Why, God? How long, Lord? They ask. How long must we suffer like this? And so in the Persian period, the answer that becomes evident to them is that, well, perhaps it's not that we are suffering for a sin, but rather that we are being tested, that we are being taunted by the devil. We are suffering because of the devil trying to get us to sin, and we have to maintain our resolve against the devil and his temptations. So it focuses more in this period on individual responsibility. So we see the individual throughout the Persian period and the Greek Hellenistic period being focused on in terms of the individual's suffering, the individual's compensation for suffering, the individual's responsibility to maintain righteousness, as opposed to the corporate nation's responsibility. So the question still remains, why do bad things happen to good people? And in the earlier periods, we don't see any valorization of a noble death, a martyrdom, per se. Why would you die like that? Why would you give up your life, so to speak? But in the later period, in the Second Temple period, we do see more of an understanding of a valorization or a positive outlook on the noble death, someone dying for a cause. because in this time period, dying for a cause, you will be compensated after death. The notion of the noble death or a martyrdom, if God is righteous, God will not allow his righteous people to suffer unjustly. He will not allow them to die unjustly. So we see all sorts of situations in some of the literature of the early to mid-Second Temple period, texts such as Daniel, the story of Daniel in the lion's den. We see the individual being willing to suffer and die for righteousness, but somehow at the very last minute, God provides some type of recompense. God provides an easy out. God provides a way to save them from actually dying. So in this time period, there's exploration, there's experimentation with that notion of suffering by the individual for the greater good, suffering by a righteous individual, coming up to the boundaries of a martyr's death, a noble death. But it never goes so far. Even the story of the 3 men in the fiery furnace, also in the book of Daniel. We see the men, they are faithful up to the point of death, but they do not die. They are saved from death. We see the same thing happen in the story of Susanna in the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. She is a righteous woman. She is wrongly accused and remains righteous. She retains her righteousness, maintains her innocence, and at the very last minute she is saved by God from certain death, unrighteous death, unjust and undeserved death. So, but it is with the books of the Maccabees, 2nd and 4th Maccabees specifically, that we see the theology taking the next step, going over the line and making asking that question, well, what if the righteous person does die? What then? What happens? And we see the story of Eleazar, a priest. We see Razis. We see, of course, the story of the 7 anonymous brothers and their mother who are tortured to death. Gruesome, horrible tortures under King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the one who we spoke about beforehand as being the one to force Hellenistic reform upon the Jews. And in this story, he is attempting to force them to eat unclean meat, pork, which has been sacrificed to gods, to unclean gods, to idols. And this family of the 7 brothers and their mother, they refuse, they resist. So they are maintaining their righteousness in the face of evil, righteousness according to God's laws. And he tortures them to death. So they are not saved from death at the very last minute like these other stories. So the books of the Maccabees, they ask that question very boldly. What happens if the righteous person does die? And the answer is that because God will not allow his righteous ones to suffer unjustly without compensation or without reward, without recompense, their compensation must be post-mortem. It must be after death. And so we see in the books of the Maccabees and other Jewish literature of the time period a conception of some clear life after death that is reward for those who are righteous. So we see that being experimented with and explored in that time period and thereafter. So these are some of the features of Second Temple Judaism, and more specifically, Judaism of the Hellenistic period. So a lot of these particular viewpoints and a lot of these particular elements begin to be laid or sown. The seeds of them are sown in the Persian period, but some of them really fully blossom and come to fruition in the Hellenistic period and into the Roman period in Judaism. So, let's take stock of where we are. The next thing that we need to talk about, of course, is the relationship between the Romans and the Jews and the Romans, a two-way relationship. And not only the Jews and the Romans, but the Jews and the other people of the Greco-Roman world, be they Greeks or Romans. And I need to bring up a term called the diaspora. It's a Greek term just meaning dispersion. And when we speak of the Jews living outside of Israel, living outside of the borders of Israel, we speak of it as the diaspora. And it's just a state of being, and it's not a particular place, it's a state of being living in the various countries, the various nations, the various regions outside of the borders of Israel. And from the Babylonian exile onwards, we see more and more Jews populating areas that are not very close to the Jerusalem temple. And the Jerusalem temple is, of course, the only place, according to the rabbinic codes, according to the priestly laws, where Yahweh can be worshipped. That is the only place. Now, of course, we see exceptions to this. The Samaritans, another form of Jews, they have their own temple on Mount Gerizim, but of course they don't get along very well with the Jews. We also have an outpost of Jews living in Egypt in the Persian period, serving the Egyptian aristocracy as mercenaries. They are living, many of them, in the colony of Elephantini, an island in the Nile River, and they have their own temple to Yahweh in that area. So these are exceptions to that rule that you can only have that one place where God is worshipped officially. But nonetheless, these are the priestly codes that we see represented in the Old Testament. The rule that you can only worship God in that one location. That is his house. That's the only place. So these laws are essentially an attempt for the priestly hierarchy to assert their control over other Jews elsewhere. So we're going to get back to this notion of ideals versus what happens de facto. We'll get to that in a minute. So in this Second Temple period, as I had said, we see an increase of the number of Jews living in the diaspora, living outside of the nation of Israel, where they are not easily accessible to the temple, where they cannot go and offer sacrifices at the Jerusalem temple on a regular basis, as needed by the various Jewish laws. So we see other conceptions of Judaism popping up in different places, as of course I mentioned the Samaritans, I mentioned the Jews in Egypt and Elephantini, each of these communities with their own version of a temple. But we also have other sects of Jews popping up, such as the Pharisees, who seem to have gotten their start in perhaps the Persian or Hellenistic period. And the Pharisees essentially focus on studying and living the Torah, or God's law, in everyday life, rather than offering sacrifices in the temple. So their sacrifice is the sacrifice of praise, the sacrifice of worship, the sacrifice of studying the law and living the Torah in everyday life, as opposed to blood sacrifices. And this is very convenient if a sect of Jews cannot actually gain access to the temple in a reasonable period of time, if you are not within walking or riding distance to the temple. So the Pharisees focus much more on reading the law, reading the Torah, studying the law, living it in daily life, and meeting in places called synagogues. And of course, synagogue in Greek means to meet or to gather, and synagogi is a place of meeting, a place of gathering. So here's an instance of Greek or Hellenistic influence in the terminology, the if you will, the religious and ecclesiological terminology of Judaism. So this goes back to the issue that we mentioned beforehand with even though the autonomy of Israel under the Hasmonean dynasty is billed as a socio-cultural religious revolution against foreigners, nonetheless, it is a fact that the Jews have taken upon them different aspects of the foreign cultures who have had influence over them. And so we have plenty of evidence of Greek being used by these very same communities. In the next segment of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about a concept that I have named the 4 C's. And I always enjoy teaching this particular concept to my classes, and I think it's a great way to understand, to encapsulate the relationship between the Jews and the Romans and the Jews. And I call it the 4 C's because you can encapsulate, you can describe neatly the relationship between these peoples by using 4 descriptive words, all beginning with the letter C. Curiosity and contempt, custom and contradiction. The 4 C's. Let's start with the bottom 2, just for arbitrary reasons. In the relationship between the Jews and their surrounding world, the way that they viewed themselves and the way that the world viewed them, we have the element, the ideal of custom. And then we have the contradiction to that custom. There is always that resistance to the custom. It's sort of the idea of de jure, what is in the law, versus de facto, what actually happens when the law is attempted to be applied. And some of the customs of the Jews, all throughout Israelite history, there has always been this an ethos or an emphasis on staying pure. Stay a nation of priests and prophets. Maintain your purity, your national, cultural, and ethnic purity, your identity as Jews. And this is a concept that we see in a lot of traditional communities, in fact, particularly in immigrant communities. When you see immigrant communities come to the United States or to other countries, there is always that push to maintain your cultural purity. Don't mix with your neighbors. Don't start watering down your culture and allowing yourself to forget the ways of your people. Don't forget the language of your people. So that's the custom. That is the ideal. Maintain your purity. And we see this all throughout the Old Testament, even embodied in different laws that may not even seem like they have anything to do with this, but on a purely symbolic level they do. The notion of not mixing one grain with another, not mixing different types of cloth or different types of thread. It's all, in many ways, embodying that commandment to not mix with the neighboring peoples. Don't start taking on the ways of the Canaanites. In much the same way that you have in immigrant communities today, there is always the pressure for a young man or a young woman to marry one of their own kind. Because the risk is that if you marry someone of another kind, from another community, another ethnic community, you may forget the ways of your people. A parent might say, a Catholic parent might say, I don't want one of my children marrying a Jew, because next thing we know, they're going to be going over to their house for the Jewish holidays. They're not going to come home for Christmas. Or conversely, a Jew might not want their child marrying a Christian. Well, the Jew is going to forget his cultural heritage. He's not going to come home for Passover anymore. He's going to be going to Easter. So in the same way, you have this proscription against marrying the Canaanites. Don't marry any of those Canaanites. I don't want any son of mine going with one of those nasty Canaanite girls. They smoke and drink and cuss and dance and do all sorts of horrible things. And next thing you know, my son's not going to come home for the Jewish holidays anymore. He's going to be going over to their house for the Canaanite holidays. So there is that emphasis on remaining pure, remaining with the customs of your people. But you always have that tendency for the culture to, in some way, shape, or form, change. No culture, no religion stays entirely the same throughout all periods of existence. The only religion that remains unchanged is a dead religion. Ancient Greek religion has not changed in approximately 16 or 1700 years. Why? Because it is dead. It is no longer practiced in the way that it had been practiced. This is, of course, notwithstanding modern neo-pagan movements, but these are arguably reinterpretations of ancient ways. They do not necessarily hold the lineage of ancient ways. So in that respect, ancient Greek religion, the religion of the gods and the deities of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, have been unchanged over the last nearly 2,000 years because they are not being practiced in that same way. They are a dead religion. A living religion consists of change, consists of adaptation. So even though you have that custom, whether we're speaking of Judaism or speaking of other religions, the custom is always diametrically opposed or interspersed with the contradictions, the things that do actually happen, that change. What are some examples of this in Israelite religion, in Jewish religion? I remember a classmate of mine a long time ago had said that the Jewish religion is the only religion that has stayed unchanged for thousands of years. In fact, Jewish religion has not changed at all in any way in 5,000 years. Well, I asked her, So you're saying that we still have a temple in Jerusalem and we are offering blood sacrifices at that temple? What about other things, such as the shift from henotheism to monotheism, things like this? These are obvious ways in which Jewish religion has changed. First of all, as we had mentioned in the last segment of this lecture, that we have Israelite religion as the moniker or the name for the First Temple period, existing under the First Temple, where Hebrew was the language, the traditional language of the Jewish people, of the Israelite people. And the religion is henotheistic, and it focuses on the temple. The worldview is monistic. But then, as time wears on, there are changes. We have the shift more towards generational responsibility, then ultimately individual responsibility. We have a shift more towards a dualistic understanding of the world. And in this period, in the Second Temple period, in the post-exilic period, in the Persian period, we see Aramaic becoming the primary traditional language of the Jewish people, supplanting Hebrew. Hebrew is still a literary language, a liturgical language, a religious language, but Aramaic becomes the language that people are communicating in and even writing texts in. And in this period, we see Jewish religion becoming monotheistic as opposed to henotheistic, as we had mentioned. These are all changes. These are contradictions to the custom. So we see the customs becoming watered down, becoming relaxed somewhat. So after a while, the contradictions are no longer contradictions, they are new customs. So these are some of the ways in which the Jews interact with their environment. So for the most part, the Jews in the Hellenistic and Roman period were seen as somewhat cliquish, keeping to themselves in enclaves in what in more recent periods would be called ghettos, staying among themselves, refraining from interacting too much with their neighbors. There is this tendency throughout Jewish history to maintain firm to the laws of the ancestors, to resist change, to hold to one's customs, to resist the changes that seem to be imposed from the outside. And particularly the Jews are always more susceptible to these contradictions, to these tendencies to change one's customs, the more contact they have with outside communities. And so we have Jews in the diaspora who are directly in contact with neighbors who are encouraging them to change. And there's nothing necessarily insidious or negative about this. You have neighbors who want to engage in social intercourse with the Jews. They want to invite them to festivals. They want to invite them over to their neighbors' houses for meals, to take part in social activities. We find Jews associating with their business associates, people that they work with. But there is always that desire, there is always that ideal to maintain a certain amount of separateness, to maintain distance from these people so that you don't begin to water down your traditions and take on the traditions of the neighbors and become much less a nation of priests and prophets. And so because of this, the Jews tended to stay among themselves. They tended to be viewed by the outsiders as a little bit cliquish, living in enclaves of their own and maintaining a certain amount of distance from the neighbors that sometimes made the neighbors think that the Jews were being deliberately standoffish, arrogant, supercilious, that they thought they were better than everyone else, when in fact it is merely just a common custom that we see in a lot of different cultures, not least of which the Jews. So, as time wore on, we still nevertheless see different elements of assimilation and change quietly happening all throughout Jewish history, and nevertheless all the while insisting, with the Jews insisting upon the originality of their ideas, that no, we are still maintaining the ways of our ancestors, we have changed nothing. And all religions tend to claim the originality of their current ideas. We see this happen in so many different religions, where they claim that nothing has changed. So despite the fact that they are adapting to new situations, allowing certain older, more strict laws to become somewhat relaxed, there is still that insistence that no, we are maintaining our purity and we have always thought this way, we have always been this way. But these are some of the trends or some of the protocols that all religions undergo in order to maintain their currency, in order to stay alive. There has to be a certain amount of change, but there has to be a certain insistence that we are not in fact changing. Because if we change, it means that what we thought beforehand was wrong, and we weren't wrong. So we're just reinterpreting it, or we're just adapting just a little bit. So this is where we speak of custom and contradiction as a neat little way to represent the way that the Jews understood themselves in the larger context of the Greco-Roman world. Now, let's talk a little bit about the top set of C words, curiosity and contempt. This set of C words neatly encapsulates the way that the Romans viewed the Jews as a constituent community in the larger empire. Now the Romans, as we had said, the province of Judea is initially incorporated in the Roman Empire under Pompey the Great in 63 BC and thereafter. And we tend to think of the Romans in general as largely tolerant masters who are okay about the local communities keeping their ways and maintaining their identity, their local national identity, as long as that community pays their homage to Rome and gives a certain amount of obeisance to Roman ways. And for the most part, this is largely true. But as much as Rome had a magnanimous, beneficent quality to their rulership, there was indeed definitely a dark side to Roman rule. There was a dark side to Roman nature. There was definitely a very prejudiced side to Roman nature. In many ways, the more conservative schools of Roman thought, the older generations, were very much afraid of outside influences. And we see this not only with the Romans' interaction with the Jews, but also with the Romans' interaction with many other communities, other religions that came in from the outside that were not easily accepted into the empire at the start. The Romans frequently considered these superstitions. They considered these religions to be unsavory, unwholesome, foreign superstitions that were deserving of destruction. They were alien to Rome. The Romans can be seen as only accepting new foreign religions when it served them, when it served their purposes. Now there are a couple of examples that I want to go over with this. So the Romans had a significant amount of curiosity about the Jews. There is even evidence of little altars or shrines to the God Yahweh, the God of the Jews, in the streets of Rome. I find this extremely interesting. So, despite the fact that the Jewish religion as a whole posits that there can only be one location for the worship of Yahweh, there is only the one temple in Jerusalem where Yahweh is permitted to be worshipped. But we see some of these little shrines popping up in the streets of Rome where Romans would perhaps flip a little coin into the shrine to pay obeisance to this particular deity. We don't really see Jews worshiping in this way, but the Romans, inasmuch as they attempted to assimilate a variety of deities for the most part from various corners of the empire, we do see an attempt to some degree for the Romans to incorporate the worship of Yahweh into the larger Greco-Roman pantheon. There is evidence of the Romans having an altar to various other deities. One might say, in the same way that in modern times we have the tomb of the unknown soldier, the Romans had the shrine to the unknown deities. And this was a way for the Romans to prevent the possibility of accidentally insulting or upsetting some foreign deity that had not yet been known or had not yet been incorporated into the Roman pantheon, that one might insult them by ignoring them or forgetting to worship them or pay obeisance to them. So it was a sort of a general apology or a disclaimer by having such an altar to the varieties of deities that were not yet known or incorporated. So the Romans did attempt to make sure that they paid proper homage to all the gods. Now, the philosopher and orator Cicero, who was a rough contemporary with Julius Caesar, he is quoted as saying that of all the nations of the earth, the Romans take better care of the gods, that they are more pious than any other nation. And he compares the Romans to other peoples of the earth who have various national or ethnic characteristics, that the Greeks are more crafty or artistic, or that the people of Spain are taller and more robust, or that the Gauls are more fierce. And he says all sorts of different things about the different ethnicities within the bounds of the empire, but he says that the Roman people are more pious or more religious than any other, that they take better care of the gods than any other people. And he implies that this is the very reason why the Romans have their great empire, because the gods have responded by favoring the Romans in response to their extreme piety and their care for the gods. It is this very sentiment that at a later time causes the Romans to be very suspicious of the Christians, and in many ways very harsh toward the Christians, because the problem is, the fear is, that if the Romans permit an ethnicity or a group within the empire to openly reject the gods who gave the empire to the Romans, who bestowed upon them this great empire, then the gods would be angry. The gods would be angry with the Romans for allowing that particular ethnicity or minority to go unchecked, unpunished, and therefore the entirety of Rome would be punished by their empire being taken away from them, or that their empire would be punished with blights and plagues and famines and things like that. So it's important that we understand a little bit about the mindset behind why the Romans were persecuting Christians and looking at them as a loathsome superstition rather than something to be tolerated as with other religions. So, of course, I am not encouraging you to forgive or to praise the Romans for their excessive cruelty to Christians, but it's important that we understand the Romans' point of view so we can understand a little bit better of what was going on. So some of this same mindset was going on with the Romans in their relationship to the Jews as well. We see the Romans expressing a certain amount of curiosity about Judaism, perhaps in some ways attempting to incorporate Judaism into the larger pantheon of the Roman world. We also see evidence of some Romans, particularly upper-class intellectual elite Romans, even as a trend, as a fad, keeping kosher food laws, or even observing the Sabbath. And in much the same way that we see some of these Hollywood types getting involved in the religious trend of the month, whether it's initially Hinduism or Buddhism or Kabbalah or yoga or different aspects of non-Western religions, because they're trendy and they're interesting and exotic. We see Hollywood types getting involved in that sort of thing in the same way we see the intellectual upper class elite of Rome getting involved in Judaism in a watered down form of way, in a watered down form of worship, very precisely because it was considered exotic. So it's not that these Romans were actually legally and socially changing their social classification and converting to Judaism, which would have involved that type of a social class change, but rather they are just observing these particular laws. In fact, we have an anecdote about Seneca, the Roman philosopher Seneca, a rough contemporary of the Emperor Nero in the latter half of the 1st century AD. We see Seneca becoming a vegetarian for philosophical reasons, but because there were many Jews around the empire who became vegetarian on account of their not being able to obtain meat that was slaughtered in a kosher fashion, Seneca's father simply assumed that his son, Seneca, had adopted these new ways of Judaism and was practicing the laws of kashrut, or becoming kosher, as part of the fad. Now, his father despised philosophy of all sorts, but particularly he was very vitriolic and judgmental about this Jewish superstition, this low and base religion of Judaism. And so he misinterpreted his son's actions, which were in fact for philosophical reasons. He misinterpreted them as if he too were also getting aboard this, climbing aboard this bandwagon of people following the kosher food laws and refraining from eating meat if they could not obtain kosher meat, effectively becoming vegetarian. So here is another example, a little anecdote of how it did become popular for many Romans of the intellectual upper class elites to follow this almost watered down form of Judaism as a trend, as an exploration. So we find that kind of curiosity among the Romans for Judaism. But contrary to that, we do have the contempt. And we see this initially in the reaction of Seneca's father against what he perceives his son Seneca is doing. That he is engaging in this low, base, common religion that really is nothing more than a fad for Romans to take part in. Now we also find a number of different expulsions of the Jews from the city of Rome. It would have been nearly impossible for the Romans to expel the Jews from the entire empire. It was too broad, and they did not have the ability to control borders to such a degree. But they did expel the Jews from the city of Rome on 3 separate occasions from the late Republic into the early imperial period. And we even have evidence of one of these times under the Emperor Claudius. And this instance is mentioned in the book of Acts, where Prisca and Aquila, 2 Jews, have recently come from Rome, and they are now associating with Paul where he is. And it is discussed in this book that they have just come from the expulsion of the Jews under the Emperor Claudius. Now it is in the writings of the historian and biographer Suetonius, Roman writer Suetonius, in talking about the Emperor Claudius and his expulsion of the Jews in this time period. He mentions a very enigmatic name, Chrestus, which we spell Chrestus. It is possible that this may be a variant spelling of the name Christus, which is how the Romans would have referred to Jesus Christ, Christus. But some scholars, such as H. Dixon Slingerland, believe that this is unlikely. It is merely one possible interpretation, but it is unlikely. Nonetheless, there is this enigmatic character, Chrestus, who is mentioned in that particular passage in Suetonius in conjunction with Claudius's expulsion of the Jews from Rome. That for whatever reason, somehow, either this Chrestus has convinced Claudius to expel the Jews, or that Chrestus has stirred the Jews up to rebellion and caused the Jews to give Claudius reason to expel them from Rome. So it really depends on how you translate or interpret that passage from the Latin, but nonetheless, here is evidence of Claudius expelling the Jews from the city of Rome for some reason that is really at this point unknown to us. Suetonius' biased account suggests that the Jews were always rebelling and always revolting and always unruly, but really a proper scholarly analysis of the behavior of the Jews in this time period does not indeed show that they were always an unruly community, but rather that for the most part they were a relatively ruly, so to speak, community that was occasionally marked by periods of attempts at autonomy or regaining their independence. And this is, I would say, highly admirable and highly understandable for any community that had been conquered by a larger hegemonic power, such as Rome. So there are, of course, other cults that are expelled from Rome early on. The Bacchic mysteries, that is, the mysteries of the cult of Dionysus, are initially expelled from the city of Rome, possibly for for reasons that are somewhat unfair and due to popular perception or misperceptions of the Bacchic cult. Ultimately, many decades, if not centuries later, the cult of Dionysus is gladly accepted into the larger culture of Roman religion. We also see the cult of Isis, which is initially a strain of Egyptian religion, which is exported to the larger Roman Empire. And outside of the bounds of the country of Egypt, it makes its way to Rome and other regions of the Roman Empire. And initially, it has difficulty being accepted into Rome. And on more than one occasion, the cult of Isis is violently expelled from the city of Rome, and its priests are treated poorly, murdered, its cultic statue thrown into the Tiber River in a sign of disrespect. We also have evidence of the cult of Magna Mater, or Great Mother, not initially gaining acceptance into the Roman pantheon very easily. So a number of these religions are initially found to be somewhat distasteful to the Romans, but gradually as time wears on, they are accepted. And with the Jews, we have this same love-hate relationship between the Jews and the Romans. We find the Jews, to some degree, holding a favored place within Roman consciousness because Judaism is a venerable, old religion. And for the most part, what is old is treated as venerable, it is treated as trustworthy in the ancient world. Something that is new is treated as untrustworthy, as suspicious. It has not been proven, tried and true just yet. And so for the most part, Judaism, on account of its age and venerability as an old, noble religion, it is afforded certain privileges, certain benefits of the doubt, whereas other newer religions might not be afforded this same sense of trust. But nonetheless, there is this love-hate relationship between the Romans and the Jews, embodied by these terms, curiosity and contempt. So the Romans essentially were tolerant of other religions when it suited them, but they could be very ethnocentric, very nationalistic, and very cruel when it did not suit them to be tolerant. We have a number of Jewish revolts while the Jews are being ruled by the Romans. These revolts take place in different regions, but the main revolts in Judea itself that we speak of are the Jewish-Roman War from 66 to 70 AD, which is spoken of at length by the Jewish historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus. And we also have a second rebellion which takes place during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian from 132 to 135, and this is referred to as the Bar Kokhba rebellion, named after the individual who foments and leads that rebellion. Each of these rebellions was decisively and cruelly put down. The first of these rebellions, the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70, results in the Second Temple being destroyed. And this is a period, this is a moment in Jewish history which I would say is unparalleled by any other. The closest thing that it comes to is the destruction of the First Temple in 587, 586 BC by the Babylonians. But that temple, of course, was rebuilt under the Persians, under King Darius, the project being finished in 515 BC, as we had mentioned earlier. And that same temple survives for approximately 500 years until 70 AD, when it is destroyed by the Romans. And such a thing, perhaps in our time, we have never even experienced anything of that sort in this nation, in the United States of America. Even 9/11 could not compare to that type of trauma that was experienced. It would have been the equivalent of 9/11s, as if the White House had in fact been destroyed by the plane that was intended to go in that direction, as if all of the houses of government had been destroyed completely by the attacking terrorists. And in addition, if we had enemy soldiers marching throughout our streets, unchecked by domestic forces, randomly murdering people in the streets. That is the rough equivalent of what happened in 70 AD. And thank heavens that in our day and age we have not experienced anything like this in the United States. So in a nutshell, after the destruction of the temple, various sects of Judaism sought ways to continue their Jewish national, cultural, religious, and ethnic identity in the wake of the destruction of the temple, in the absence of the temple. They needed to find a way to continue to be Jews, to think of themselves as being Jews without that temple, without the sacrificial cultus of Yahweh. And two major groups arose which had viable ways to continue one's Judaism without the temple. One was the sect of the Pharisees, which we had mentioned briefly before, which focused on practicing one's Judaism in daily life, practicing one's Judaism by way of studying the Torah and practicing the purity codes, rather than blood sacrifice in the temple. And the Pharisees, who, at least in Judea, at least in Jerusalem at that time, were a largely unpopular, a relatively rare sect at that time. They had, in fact, had more popularity in the diaspora in places where people could not visit the temple on a regular basis. And that group of Jews, the Pharisaic Jews, who many scholars believe ultimately gave rise to Rabbinic Judaism in the later periods, the Pharisaic Jews said, we've been worshiping Yahweh without the appeal to the temple for several centuries at this point. And one can continue one's Judaism in the post-Second Temple era by being one of us. Now, the other community that I spoke of that offered a viable way of continuing one's Judaism in the post-Second Temple period is the sect of the Christians, who initially, of course, began as a sect of Judaism, and only at a later point began to be considered as a separate religion in and of itself, separate and distinct from Judaism. But Christianity, or Christian Judaism, offered a way of continuing one's Jewish national and ethnic and religious identity without appeal to the temple. And at this time, in the wake of the destruction of the temple, the Christians were saying, well, we've been revering the Messiah as we believe he was for the last generation, and join with us and we can continue to hold our Judaism close to our hearts, revering this Messiah who came and was crucified under Pontius Pilate ever so long ago, and we can be Jews together in this new post-Second Temple era. So Christianity sought to be the new Judaism, the new way of maintaining one's Jewishness in the post-Second Temple era. So let me say a few things about the various sects of Judaism that existed at this time period so that we can understand a little bit more about the Jews that Jesus has conversations with and are his interlocutors in the Gospels of the New Testament. Now, Philo of Alexandria, who is a rough contemporary of Jesus, he lives in the first half of the first century A.D. He is a Jew living in Alexandria, Egypt. He speaks of perhaps as many as 70 different sects of Judaism in his time period. Josephus, Flavius Josephus, who we had mentioned, is a historian. He's a Jew. He becomes an advisor to the Emperor Vespasian after the Jewish-Roman War is over. He lives a charmed life and is able to avoid execution by the Romans as a spy, as a traitor, as a rebel. But he ultimately wins himself into the good graces of the imperial court, and he writes the history of the Jews, the antiquities of the Jews. He also writes the history of the Jewish-Roman War, very much in a slightly biased point of view, his purposes being to help encourage peace between the Romans and the Jews. But Josephus tells us about roughly 4 major sects of Jews in this time period. He speaks of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the so-called Fourth Philosophy. And I will write these here. So we have the Sadducees, which were largely the dominant sect of Judaism in the Second Temple period during Jesus' day, prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. They were a largely conservative, fairly old school, monistic in many ways, monistic school of Jewish thought. They were a throwback to earlier Old Testament times, but they were largely the sect that was in power in Jerusalem in Jesus' day. And in the New Testament Gospels, we hear that they did not believe in body-soul dualism or a judgment day or anything of the sort. We, however, have the Pharisees, who, as I had said, were a largely unpopular sect in Jerusalem at this time. They were not in power, despite what the Gospel accounts suggest to us, and we'll get back to why those accounts are written in that way. But the Pharisees have more popularity in the diaspora at this time, but fairly little popularity in Jerusalem at this time. And they did believe in a dualistic worldview, body-soul dualism, life after death. They seem to have awaited a Messiah and a judgment day and so forth. In many ways, the Pharisees, the Pharisaic Jews and the Christian Jews, seem to be very closely related in terms of many of their ideas. They were perhaps like brothers fighting over an inheritance in this post-Second Temple period. So we have the Pharisees, we have the Essenes, who were a largely separatist sect of Jews who believed that the temple priesthood and the temple hierarchy had been perverted, and they retreated out into the Judean desert and lived on their own, awaiting a new age when the temple would be purified. Then lastly, we have the fourth philosophy that Josephus refers to, which appeared to have been political revolutionaries such as the Zealots, who believed in the violent overthrow of the Roman government. It is largely obscure to us as to what their religious beliefs were, but we know at least a bit about their socio-political beliefs. So it's possible that Josephus is simplifying the number of sects of Jews that we see mentioned in Philo, who tells us of 70 different sects of Jews. But whichever, we see a number of different sects that are evident in Second Temple Judaism of this time. And this is the backdrop against which the New Testament is written. These are the Jews with whom Jesus has daily life and daily intercourse. I, of course, also want to mention regarding the Essenes that it has been commonly assumed that the community that produced and shepherded the scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls at the community of Qumran, were Essenes. There are, of course, some varying viewpoints, some scholars which are questioning that assumption, but either way, that has been the general scholarly assumption over the last generation or so, that the Qumran community were comprised of Essenes or something like Essenes, some type of a community like them. It is often assumed that Jews of this time period all believed the same thing. This erroneous idea is often termed monolithic Judaism, and there was no such thing as monolithic Judaism in this period. The most egregious representation of this ideology was that all Jews were awaiting a Messiah, and indeed the same type of Messiah, who was to fulfill a prescribed set of predictions and signs. Analysis of Judaism in the Second Temple period has not borne out this assumption. In fact, Judaism was a widely divergent set of sects. For one, the Sadducees did not even believe in a future Messiah, since there was no cosmic reason for a restoration or judgment day. Analysis of the various messianic expectations, both amid biblical texts and extra-biblical writings of contemporary Jews, shows us that not all Jews were awaiting the same type of Messiah. Of the Jews that did await a Messiah, there was no consensus on what this Messiah was supposed to look like, or do, or fulfill. The set of scriptures used by Christians to prefigure the Messiah, teased out of the Old Testament, were used only by Christians. Most of these texts had their own historical context, which was not originally messianic, but pertained to the narratives of the stories in which they were included. In order to be interpreted messianically, they had to be divested from their original contexts and interpreted allegorically or symbolically. The other groups of Messianic Jews had their own set of Messianic scriptures, each supporting their own theories of what kind of a Messiah was to be expected. Some awaited a kingly Messiah, like a new King David, who would come with military might and crush the Romans and any other foreign overlords currently oppressing Jews. Others awaited a high priestly Messiah, who would restore the temple to its former glory and purge the high priesthood of any impostors or pretenders. The Qumran community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls was among these. Others awaited an angelic Messiah coming on the clouds of heaven, as mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. There were many others as well, but the Christians were unique in interpreting the Messiah as a figure to be killed for the sake of the salvation of humanity. To all other Jews, the violent death of the Messiah would have indicated his failure, and therefore his disqualification as the Messiah. It is this very factor, namely that most Jews who awaited a Messiah could not conceive of a Messiah who would be crucified, which demonstrates that Christian Jews and other Messianic Jews had an entirely different set of expectations for the Messiah, and therefore an entirely different set of scriptural passages to support their expectations. I wanted to mention one other thing regarding the contradiction to custom, and I think this is extremely interesting. In the Second Temple period, the book of 2nd Maccabees mentions some of the bodies of the Maccabean soldiers, the soldiers who took part in the Maccabean revolt. Some of them are wearing pagan amulets. And what we see here is almost an appeal to not wanting to leave any stone unturned when your life is on the line. Here's an instance of, okay, well, we worship Yahweh alone, the one God of the Israelites, but, my girlfriend gave me this lucky rabbit's foot, so I might as well carry it around with me. Anyway, it couldn't hurt. Now, of course, one may make a case that these dead bodies of the Maccabeans that had the pagan amulets on them, that the reason that they died was that God did not protect them on account of their faithlessness to Israel. But nonetheless, we can probably assume that there were a few Maccabees running around with pagan amulets around their necks who did in fact survive the revolt. We also, of course, see evidence within some of the synagogues in the Second Temple period, particularly from the Hellenistic period and thereafter. We see certain pagan symbols and signs being incorporated into the general artwork and architecture of the synagogues. We see zodiacs, which obviously are incorporating Greco-Roman symbolism into them, and zodiac motifs in the mosaics of the floors. We also see, even in some situations, swastikas. And this, of course, has at times shocked archaeologists of a more traditional set who the only contact they had with the notion of a swastika was, of course, its usage during Nazi Germany. So there were synagogues that were excavated in Dura Europos in Syria, and synagogues all over the diaspora, which have swastikas incorporated in the mosaic motifs. It has shocked people, but in fact these were certain pagan motifs that were used well before Nazi Germany ever co-opted these symbols. The usage of the swastika goes back as far as ancient Indic traditions, but it is, of course, also incorporated into certain motifs and artistic forms in the Greco-Roman world. And we find these things incorporated into the artistic traditions of the synagogues in the Second Temple period. And it is not necessarily that the religion of those synagogues was being watered down by paganism, but rather that some of these symbols and some of these motifs and artistic forms were considered non-religious or beyond religion, that they were perhaps cross-cultural artistic forms that were innocuous enough that they could be incorporated in the artistic format of the synagogue, in much the same way that today in a synagogue in the middle of an urban city in the United States, they might have perhaps little decorations for Halloween, which originally was a religious holiday or festival, but now has become a cultural or social holiday. So much in the same way, you see that notion of watering down of the custom in favor of the contradiction. Once again, the proscription among Jewish communities in Jewish law against graven images. That is the custom, but the usage of some of these artistic forms such as the zodiac, depictions of little signs of the zodiac, is the contradiction against the proscription against graven images, images of actual things, people, living beings, as opposed to abstract artistic forms. Let me say one more note about the pagan or Greco-Roman curiosity for the Jews. We find a phenomenon in Second Temple Judaism of older, wealthy Greek women, for some reason, having interest in the Jewish synagogue. It's just sort of a topos or an ethos or a phenomenon for whatever reason. But this is incorporated in the larger phenomenon of what we see called in the New Testament God-fearers, where there are non-Jews who are supportive of the Jewish community, either morally, in terms of lending their morale to the community, or also even in some cases financially. They are supportive of the Jewish community. They look at the Jewish community as if it were the right way to be, that the God of the Israelites was in fact the true one God of the universe, but that these pagans, were not necessarily willing to undergo a circumcision, to legally change their status, their social status, to become Jews. But they nonetheless feared God. One might say they were God-fearers. They respected the Jewish God, they respected the Jewish religion, and they supported the Jewish community. So here's another example of pagan curiosity towards Judaism. So we have side-by-side curiosity and contempt, custom and contradiction. These words embody or encapsulate the relationship between the Jews and their surrounding, and how the Romans viewed the Jews within their empire. So Judaism largely enjoyed the status of what we call a religio licita, which I believe I mentioned last time, a legal religion, because it was an old religion, it was venerable. And we see this at play when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, where we see Matthew's Christian community attempting to ride on the coattails of Judaism so as to not fall under the suspicion of the Romans, being that Christianity could very easily be considered a new religion, a superstition, and therefore loathsome and worthy of persecution. So this form of Christianity attempts to reassert its Jewishness and to enjoy the benefits of trustworthiness and venerability that Judaism generally enjoyed in the Roman Empire. But, as I had said, there are exceptions to this rule, and the Roman cruelty that we see from time to time reared its ugly head in the contempt factor. That at times Rome could be very cruel to certain constituent communities that simply did not play along. Occasionally this was directed at the Jews, occasionally it was directed at the Christians. So, that brings to a conclusion our lecture for today. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking with you further next time as we delve more into some of the New Testament scriptures. Next time we will talk about the Apostle Paul and his writings and his understanding of this new sect of Judaism. Thank you.